Spiritual Authority and Temporal Power. Poor Rene Guenon. Forward. We are not in the habit, in our works, of referring to immediate current events, for what we constantly have in view are principles which are, one might say, of permanent relevance because they are outside of time. And even if we step outside the domain of pure metaphysics to consider certain applications, we always do so in such a way that these applications retain an entirely general scope. This is what we shall do here once again. Yet, we must admit that the considerations we are about to set forth in this study also offer a certain more particular interest at the present moment, on account of the discussions that have arisen in recent times regarding the question of the relationship between religion and politics, a question which is but a special form taken, under certain determinate conditions, by that of the relationship between the spiritual and the temporal. This is true, but it would be a mistake to believe that these considerations were more or less inspired by the incidents to which we allude, or that we intend to connect them directly thereto, for that would be to grant a greatly exaggerated importance to things that possess a purely episodic character and could not possibly influence conceptions whose nature and origin are in reality of an entirely different order. As we always strive to dispel in advance all the misunderstandings we can possibly foresee, we are anxious to set aside above all, as clearly and explicitly as possible, this false interpretation that some might give to our thought, whether out of political or religious passion, or by virtue of some preconceived ideas, or even out of a simple lack of understanding of the standpoint we adopt. Everything we shall say here we would have said just as well, and in exactly the same way, had the facts that today call attention to the question of the spiritual and the temporal not occurred. The present circumstances have merely shown us, more clearly than ever, that it was necessary and timely to say it. They have been, if one wishes, the occasion that has led us to set forth certain truths now, in preference to many others which we also intend to formulate should time not fail us, but which do not seem susceptible to such an immediate application, and there their entire role has ended as far as we are concerned. What has struck us above all in the discussions in question is that, neither on one side nor the other, did anyone seem primarily concerned with situating the questions upon their proper ground, with making a precise distinction between the essential and the accidental, between necessary principles and contingent circumstances. And, to tell the truth, this came as no surprise to us, for we saw in it but one more example, following many others, of the confusion that reigns today in all domains, and which we regard as eminently characteristic of the modern world, for reasons we have explained in previous works. Nevertheless, we cannot help but deplore the fact that this confusion affects even the representatives of an authentic spiritual authority, who thus seem to lose sight of what ought to constitute their true strength. We mean the transcendence of the doctrine in whose name they are qualified to speak. Above all, it would have been necessary to distinguish between the question of principle and the question of expediency. On the first, there is no room for discussion, for it involves things belonging to a domain that cannot be subjected to the essentially profane procedures of discussion. And as for the second, which is moreover only of a political and, one might say, diplomatic order, it is in any case very secondary, and even, strictly speaking, should not count at all in relation to the question of principle. Consequently, it would have been preferable not even to afford the adversary the opportunity to raise it, were it only based on mere appearances. We might add that, as far as we are concerned, it interests us not in the least. For our part, therefore, we intend to position ourselves exclusively within the domain of principles. This is what allows us to remain entirely aloof from any discussion, any polemic, any quarrel of school or party, things in which we wish to be involved neither closely nor remotely, in any capacity or to any degree whatsoever, being absolutely independent of everything that is not the pure and disinterested truth, and firmly resolved to remain so, we simply propose to state things exactly as they are, without the slightest concern for pleasing or displeasing anyone. We have nothing to expect from either side. We do not even expect that those who might benefit from the ideas we formulate will be in any way grateful to us, and, moreover, that matters very little to us. We give warning once again that we are not disposed to let ourselves be confined within any of the ordinary frameworks, and that it would be perfectly futile to attempt to attach any label whatsoever to us, for among those current in the Western world, there is none that actually suits us. Certain insinuations, coming moreover simultaneously from the most opposing sides, have shown us quite recently that it would be well to renew this declaration, so that people of good faith may know where they stand and not be led into attributing to us intentions incompatible with our true attitude and with the purely doctrinal standpoint which is ours. It is due to the very nature of this standpoint, detached from all contingencies, that we are able to view present facts as completely impartially as if they were events belonging to a distant past, like those which will primarily be discussed here when we come to cite historical examples to illuminate our exposition. It must be clearly understood that we give to this exposition, as we stated from the beginning, an entirely general scope, going beyond all the particular forms that temporal power and even spiritual authority can assume according to time and place. And it must be specified in particular, without further delay, that the latter, for us, does not necessarily take a religious form, contrary to what is commonly imagined in the West. We leave it to each individual to make such application of these considerations as they may deem appropriate with respect to particular cases which we purposely abstain from addressing directly. It suffices that this application, in order to be legitimate and valid, be made in a spirit truly conforming to the principles upon which everything depends, a spirit which is what we call the traditional spirit in the true sense of the word, and of which, unfortunately, all specifically modern tendencies are the antithesis or negation. This is precisely one of the aspects of the modern deviation that we shall once again have to consider, and in this regard, the present study will complement what we have already had occasion to explain in the works to which we alluded earlier. It will be seen, moreover, that on this question of the relationship between the spiritual and the temporal, the errors that have developed over the past few centuries are far from new. But at least their earlier manifestations had never had anything but rather limited effects, whereas today these same errors have become somehow inherent in the common mentality, forming an integral part of a state of mind that is becoming increasingly generalized. This is indeed what is most particularly grave and alarming, and, unless a rectification occurs in the near future, it is to be expected that the modern world will be drawn into some catastrophe, toward which it even seems to be marching with ever-increasing speed. Having set forth elsewhere the considerations that can justify this assertion, we shall not dwell upon it further, and we shall add only this. If there is still, under present circumstances, any hope of salvation for the Western world, it seems that this hope must reside, at least in part, in maintaining the sole traditional authority that survives therein. But for this to be so, it is necessary that this authority be fully conscious of itself, so that it may be capable of providing an effective basis for efforts that otherwise risk remaining scattered and uncoordinated. This is, at the very least, one of the most immediate means that might be considered for a restoration of the traditional spirit. There are undoubtedly others should this one fail. But since this restoration, which is the sole remedy for the present disorder, is the essential goal we constantly have in view as soon as, stepping outside of pure metaphysics, we come to consider contingencies, it is easy to understand why we neglect none of the possibilities that present themselves for achieving Even if these possibilities appear for the time being to have little chance of realization. It is in this, and in this alone, that our true intentions consist. Any others that might be attributed to us, apart from these, are entirely non-existent. And if anyone were to claim that the reflections that follow have been inspired by any external influences whatsoever, we offer them in advance the most formal denial. That being said, because we know from experience that such precautions are not unwarranted, we believe we can hereafter dispense with any direct allusion to current events, in order to make the strictly doctrinal character we wish to maintain in all our work even more apparent and indisputable. No doubt, political or religious passions will find nothing to satisfy them here, but this is something upon which we can only congratulate ourselves, for it is by no means our intention to provide new fuel for discussions that seem to us quite vain, and even rather pitiful, but on the contrary to recall the principles whose forgetfulness is, fundamentally, the only true cause of all such discussions. It is, we repeat, our very independence that allows us to make this clarification with complete impartiality, without concessions or compromises of any kind. And, at the same time, it forbids us any role other than the one we have just defined, for it can be maintained only on the condition of always remaining within the purely intellectual domain, a domain which, moreover, is that of essential and immutable principles, and consequently the one from which everything else derives more or less directly, and with which the rectification we mentioned earlier must necessarily begin. Outside of an attachment to principles, one can achieve only entirely external, unstable, and illusory results. But this, in truth, is nothing other than one of the forms of the very affirmation of the supremacy of the spiritual over the temporal, which is precisely to be the subject of this study. Chapter 1. Authority and Hierarchy. At widely differing periods of history, and even going back well beyond what are conventionally called historical times, insofar as it is possible for us to do so with the aid of the concordant testimonies provided by the oral or written traditions of all peoples, we find indications of a frequent opposition between the representatives of two powers, one spiritual and the other temporal, whatever special forms each of these two powers may have assumed in order to adapt to the diversity of circumstances depending on the era and the country. This is not to say, however, that this opposition and the struggles it engenders are as old as the world, to use an expression that is too often abused. That would be an obvious exaggeration, for in order for them to occur, humanity must already have reached, according to the teaching of all traditions, a phase quite far removed from pure primordial spirituality. Besides, at their origin, the two powers in question could not have existed in the state of separate functions exercised respectively by different individuals. On the contrary, both must have then been contained within the common principle from which they proceed, and of which they represented only two indivisible aspects, indissolubly linked in the unity of a synthesis that was both superior and prior to their distinction. This is notably expressed by Hindu doctrine when it teaches that at first there was only a single caste. The name Hamsa, which is given to this unique primitive caste, indicates a very high spiritual degree, today quite exceptional, but which was then common to all men and which they possessed, as it were, spontaneously. And this degree is beyond the four castes that were formed internally, and among which the different social functions were distributed. The principle of the institution of castes, so completely misunderstood by Westerners, is nothing other than the difference in nature that exists among human individuals, and which establishes among them a hierarchy the disregard of which can only bring about disorder and confusion. It is precisely this disregard that is implied in the egalitarian theory so dear to the modern world, a theory that is contrary to all the best established facts, and which is even belied by simple everyday observation, since equality exists nowhere in reality. But this is not the place to dwell upon this point, which we have already addressed elsewhere. The words used to designate caste in India mean nothing other than individual nature. This must be understood as the set of characteristics that are added to specific human nature to differentiate individuals from one another. And it should be added at once that heredity plays only a partial role in determining these characteristics, otherwise all individuals of the same family would be exactly alike, so that caste is not strictly hereditary in principle, although it may most often have become so in fact and in application. Furthermore, since there can be no two individuals who are identical or equal in every respect, there are inevitably still differences between those who belong to the same caste. But just as there are more common characteristics among beings of the same species than among beings of different species, there are also more of them within the species among individuals of the same caste than among those of different castes. One could therefore say that the distinction of castes constitutes, within the human species, a true natural classification to which the distribution of social functions must correspond. Indeed, each man, by reason of his own nature, is suited to fulfill certain defined functions to the exclusion of certain others. And in a society regularly established upon traditional foundations, these aptitudes must be determined according to precise rules, so that, through the correspondence of the various types of functions with the broad divisions of the classification of individual natures, and barring exceptions due to application errors that are always possible but reduced, so to speak, to a minimum, each person finds himself in the place he ought normally to occupy, and thus the social order exactly translates the hierarchical relationships that result from the very nature of beings. Such is, summarized in a few words, the fundamental reason for the existence of castes. And it is necessary to know at least these essential notions in order to understand the allusions we will inevitably be led to make later on, whether to their constitution as it exists in India, or to the analogous institutions found elsewhere, for it is evident that the same principles, although with diverse modalities of application, have presided over the organization of all civilizations possessing a truly traditional character. The distinction of castes, along with the differentiation of social functions to which it corresponds, results, in short, from a rupture of primitive unity, and it is then that spiritual power and temporal power also appear, as separated from one another, constituting precisely, in their distinct exercise, the respective functions of the first two castes, that of the Brahmins and that of the Kshatriyas. Moreover, between these two powers, as more generally between all the social functions henceforth attributed to different groups of individuals, there must originally have been a perfect harmony, by which the primal unity was maintained as much as the conditions of humanity's existence in its new phase allowed, for harmony is, in short, merely a reflection or an image of true unity. It was only at another stage that this distinction was to transform into opposition and rivalry, that harmony was to be destroyed and give way to the struggle between the two powers, until such time as the lower functions should in turn lay claim to supremacy, ultimately leading to the most complete confusion, to the negation and the overthrow of all hierarchy. The general conception we have thus outlined in its broad strokes is in conformity with the traditional doctrine of the four successive ages into which the history of terrestrial humanity is divided, a doctrine that is found not only in India but which was also known to Western antiquity, and especially to the Greeks and Latins. These four ages are the different phases that humanity passes through as it moves away from the principle, and therefore from primordial unity and spirituality. They are like the stages of a sort of progressive materialization, necessarily inherent in the development of any cycle of manifestation, as we have explained elsewhere. It is only in the last of these four ages, which the Hindu tradition calls the Kali Yuga or Dark Age, and which corresponds to the epoch in which we currently live, that the subversion of the normal order could occur and that, first of all, temporal power could prevail over the spiritual. But the first manifestations of the revolt of the Kshatriyas against the authority of the Brahmins can nonetheless be traced back much further than the beginning of this age, a beginning which is itself far anterior to anything known to ordinary or profane history. This opposition of the two powers, this rivalry of their respective representatives, was represented among the Celts under the figure of the struggle of the boar and the bear, according to a symbolism of Hyperborean origin, which connects to one of the most ancient traditions of humanity, if not indeed to the first of all, to the true primordial tradition. And this symbolism could give rise to ample developments, which cannot find a place here, but which we shall perhaps have the opportunity to expound upon someday. In what follows, we have no intention of going back to the origins in this manner, and all our examples will be drawn from epochs much closer to us, comprised entirely within what we may call the latter part of the Kali Yuga, that which is accessible to ordinary history, and which begins exactly in the 6th century before the Christian era. It was nonetheless necessary to provide these summary notions concerning the whole of traditional history, without which the remainder would be only very imperfectly understood. For one cannot truly understand any epoch without situating it in the place it occupies within the whole of which it is one of the elements. It is thus that, as we recently had occasion to show, the particular characteristics of the modern epoch can only be explained if it is considered as constituting the final phase of the Kali Yuga. We know well that this synthetic point of view is entirely contrary to the analytical spirit that presides over the development of profane science, the only one known to most of our contemporaries. But it is precisely necessary to affirm it all the more clearly the more it is disregarded, and moreover, it is the only one that can be adopted by all those who, like ourselves, intend to stand strictly in the line of true traditional orthodoxy, without any concession to this modern spirit which we cannot repeat too often, is one and the same as the anti-traditional spirit itself. Undoubtedly, the tendency currently prevailing is to treat the facts of the most distant history as legendary, or even mythical, such as those we have just alluded to, or even certain others which are yet much less ancient, like some of those that may be discussed later on, because they elude the means of investigation available to profane historians. Those who might think in this way, by virtue of habits acquired through an education that today is too often nothing more than a true mental deformation, will at least be able, if despite everything they have retained certain possibilities of comprehension, to take these facts simply for their symbolic value. As for ourselves, we know that this value deprives them of nothing of their own reality as historical facts, but it is, in short, what matters most, because it confers upon them a superior significance of an order much deeper than that which they could have in themselves. And this too is a point that requires some explanation. Everything that is, in whatever mode it may be, necessarily participates in universal principles, and nothing exists except by participation in these principles, which are the eternal and immutable essences contained in the permanent actuality of the divine intellect. Consequently, it can be said that all things, however contingent they may be in themselves, translate or represent principles in their own way and according to their order of existence, for otherwise they would be but pure nothingness. Thus, from one order to another, all things are linked and correspond to concur in universal and total harmony, for harmony, as we already indicated above, is nothing other than the reflection of principial unity within the multiplicity of the manifested world. And it is this correspondence that is the true foundation of symbolism. This is why the laws of a lower domain can always be taken to symbolize the realities of a higher order, where they find their profound reason, which is at once their principle and their end. And we may point out in passing, on this occasion, the error of modern naturalistic interpretations of ancient traditional doctrines, interpretations which purely and simply invert the hierarchy of relations between the different orders of realities. For example, to consider only one of the most widespread theories of our day, symbols or myths have never had the role of representing the movement of the stars. Rather, what is true is that one often finds in them figures inspired by the latter and intended to express analogically something entirely different, because the laws of this movement physically translate the metaphysical principles on which they depend. And it is upon this that the true astrology of the ancients rested. The lower can symbolize the higher, but the reverse is impossible. Besides, if the symbol were further removed from the sensible order than what it represents, instead of being closer to it, how could it fulfill the function for which it is destined, which is to make truth more accessible to man by providing a support for his conception of it? On the other hand, it is quite evident that the use of astronomical symbolism, to take up the same example again, in no way prevents astronomical phenomena from existing as such and from having, in their own order, all the reality of which they are capable. It is exactly the same for historical facts, for these, like all others, express higher truths according to their mode and conform to this law of correspondence that we have just indicated. These facts, too, genuinely exist as such, but at the same time they are also symbols. And, from our point of view, they are much more worthy of interest as symbols than as facts. Cannot be otherwise, since we intend to relate everything to principles, and this is precisely, as we have explained elsewhere, what essentially distinguishes sacred science from profane science. If we have somewhat insisted upon this, it is so that no confusion may arise in this regard. One must know how to place everything in the rank that normally belongs to it. History, on the condition of being considered as it should be, has, like everything else, its place in integral knowledge, but it has no value in this respect except insofar as it allows one to find, within the very contingencies that are its immediate object, a point of support for rising above these contingencies. As for the point of view of profane history, which attaches itself exclusively to facts and does not go beyond them, it is of no interest in our eyes, just like everything that belongs to the domain of mere erudition. It is therefore not at all as an historian, if understood in this sense, that we consider the facts, and this is what allows us to completely disregard certain critical prejudices particularly dear to our time. Moreover, it indeed seems that the exclusive use of certain methods has been imposed on modern historians only to prevent them from seeing clearly into questions that were not to be touched upon, for the simple reason that they might have led them to conclusions contrary to the materialistic tendencies that official teaching had the mission of making prevail. It goes without saying that, for our part, we feel in no way bound to maintain the same reserve. That being said, we therefore believe we can directly approach the subject of our study, without lingering any longer on these preliminary observations, which ultimately have no other purpose than to define as clearly as possible the spirit in which we are writing it, and in which it must also be read if one truly wishes to understand its meaning. Chapter 2. Functions of the priesthood and royalty. The opposition of the two powers, spiritual and temporal, in one form or another, is to be found among almost all peoples. This is not surprising, since it corresponds to a general law of human history, connected, moreover, to the entirety of those cyclic laws to which we have made frequent allusions in almost all our works. For the most ancient periods, this opposition is usually found expressed in a symbolic form within traditional data, as we have already indicated previously regarding the Celts. But it is not this aspect of the question that we specifically propose to develop here. For the moment, we shall mainly retain two historical examples, one taken from the East and the other from the West. In India, the antagonism in question is encountered in the form of the rivalry between the Brahmanas and the Kshatriyas, of which we shall have to recount a few episodes. In medieval Europe, it appears above all as what has been called the quarrel between the priesthood and the empire, although it also had other more particular, but no less characteristic aspects at that time, as will be seen later. It would, moreover, be only too easy to note that the same struggle continues in our day, although, due to modern disorder and the mixing of castes, it is complicated by heterogeneous elements that may sometimes conceal it from the eyes of a superficial observer. It is not that it has been contested, at least generally and outside of certain extreme cases, that these two powers, which we may call the sacerdotal power and the royal power, for these are their true traditional designations, both have their reason for being and their own domain. In short, the debate usually bears only on the question of the hierarchical relations that must exist between them. It is a struggle for supremacy, and this struggle invariably occurs in the same way. We see the warriors, holders of temporal power, after having initially been subjected to spiritual authority, revolt against it, declare themselves independent of any higher power, or even seek to subordinate to themselves this authority from which they had originally acknowledged receiving their power, and to make it an instrument in the service of their own domination. This alone can suffice to show that there must be, in such a revolt, an inversion of normal relations, but one sees it even more clearly when considering these relations as being, not simply those of two more or less clearly defined social functions, each of which may have the rather natural tendency to encroach upon the other, but those of the two domains in which these functions are respectively exercised. Indeed, it is the relations of these domains that must logically determine those of the corresponding powers. However, before approaching these considerations directly, we must first formulate a few observations that will facilitate their comprehension by clarifying the meaning of certain terms that we will have to use constantly. And this is all the more necessary since these terms, in current usage, have taken on a rather vague meaning that is sometimes quite far removed from their original acceptation. First of all, if we speak of two powers, and if we are able to do so in cases where it is fitting, for various reasons, to keep a kind of outward symmetry between them, we nevertheless prefer, more often than not, and to better emphasize the distinction, to employ the word authority for the spiritual order, rather than power, which is then reserved for the temporal order, to which it more properly applies when understood in the strict sense. Indeed, this word power almost inevitably evokes the idea of might or force, and above all of a material force, of a might that manifests visibly on the outside and asserts itself through the use of external means, and such is indeed, by its very definition, temporal power. On the contrary, spiritual authority, interior by essence, asserts itself only by itself, independently of any sensible support, and is exercised in a somewhat invisible manner. If one can still speak here of might or force, it is only by analogical transposition and, at least in the case of a spiritual authority in its pure state, so to speak, it must be well understood that it is then a wholly intellectual might, whose name is wisdom, and of the sole force of truth. What also needs to be explained, and even at somewhat greater length, are the expressions we used earlier, sacerdotal power and royal power. What exactly should be understood here by priesthood and royalty? To begin with the latter, we shall say that the royal function encompasses everything that, in the social order, constitutes the government strictly speaking, and this even if this government does not have a monarchical form. This function, indeed, is the one that properly belongs to the entire caste of the Kshatriyas, and the king is only the first among them. The function in question is twofold in a certain way. administrative and judicial on the one hand, military on the other, for it must ensure the maintenance of order both within as a regulating and balancing function, and without as a protective function of the social organization. These two constitutive elements of royal power are, in various traditions, symbolized respectively by the scales and the sword. One can see from this that royal power is indeed truly synonymous with temporal power, even taking the latter in the fullest extension of which it is capable. But the much more restricted idea that the modern West forms of royalty may prevent this equivalence from becoming immediately apparent, and this is why it was necessary to formulate this definition now, which must never be lost sight of hereafter. As for the priesthood, its essential function is the preservation and transmission of the traditional doctrine, in which every regular social organization finds its fundamental principles. This function, moreover, is obviously independent of all the special forms that the doctrine may assume in order to adapt itself, in its expression, to the particular conditions of a given people or epoch, and which in no way affect the very essence of this doctrine, which remains everywhere and always identical and immutable, provided it concerns authentically orthodox traditions. It is easy to understand that the function of the priesthood is not exactly that which Western conceptions, especially today, attribute to the clergy or to priests, or that at least, if it can be that to a certain extent and in certain cases, it can also be something quite different. Indeed, what properly possesses the sacred character is the traditional doctrine and what directly relates to it, and this doctrine does not necessarily take a religious form. Sacred and religious are thus by no means equivalent, and the first of these two terms is much broader than the second. If religion forms part of the sacred domain, the latter comprises elements and modalities that have absolutely nothing religious about them, and the priesthood, as its name indicates, relates, without any restriction, to everything that can truly be called sacred. The true function of the priesthood is thus, above all, a function of knowledge and teaching, and this is why, as we said above, its proper attribute is wisdom. To be sure, certain other more external functions, such as the performance of rites, also belong to it, because they require knowledge of the doctrine, in principle at least, and partake of the sacred character inherent to it. But these functions are only secondary, contingent, and in a way accidental. If, in the Western world, the accessory here seems to have become the principal, if not the sole function, it is because the real nature of the priesthood is almost completely forgotten there. This is one of the effects of the modern deviation which negates intellectuality, and which, if it has not been able to make all doctrinal teaching disappear, has at least minimized it and relegated it to the background. That it has not always been so is proven by the very word clergy. For, originally, cleric meant nothing other than scholar, and it is opposed to layman, which designates the man of the people, that is to say, of the vulgar, likened to the ignorant or the profane, of whom one can only ask to believe what he is incapable of understanding, because that is the only means of making him participate in the tradition to the extent of his possibilities. It is even curious to note that the people who, in our time, take pride in calling themselves laymen, just as much as those who take pleasure in styling themselves agnostics, and moreover they are often the same people, are in doing so only boasting of their own ignorance. And for them not to realize that such is the meaning of the labels with which they adorn themselves, this ignorance must indeed be very great and truly irremediable. If the priesthood is, by essence, the repository of traditional knowledge, this is not to say that it has a monopoly over it, since its mission is not only to preserve it entirely, but also to communicate it to all those who are capable of receiving it, to distribute it in a somewhat hierarchical manner according to the intellectual capacity of each. All knowledge of this order thus has its source in sacerdotal teaching, which is the organ of its regular transmission, and what appears to be more particularly reserved for the priesthood, due to its character of pure intellectuality, is the higher part of the doctrine, that is to say the knowledge of the principles themselves, while the development of certain applications is better suited to the aptitudes of other men, whom their own functions place in direct and constant contact with the manifested world, that is, with the domain to which these applications relate. This is why we see in India, for example, that certain secondary branches of the doctrine were studied more especially by the Kshatriyas, while the Brahmins attach only a very relative importance to them, their attention being ceaselessly fixed upon the order of transcendent and immutable principles, of which all the rest is but accidental consequences, or, taking things in the opposite sense, upon the supreme goal in relation to which all the rest is but contingent and subordinate means. There even exist traditional books that are particularly intended for the use of the Kshatriyas, because they present doctrinal aspects adapted to their proper nature. There are traditional sciences that are suited above all to the Kshatriyas, while pure metaphysics is the prerogative of the Brahmins. There is nothing in this that is not perfectly legitimate, for these applications or adaptations also form part of sacred knowledge considered in its entirety, and moreover, although the priestly caste does not interest itself directly in them on its own account, they are nevertheless its work, since it alone is qualified to verify their perfect conformity with the principles. However, it can happen that the Kshatriyas, when they revolt against the spiritual authority, disregard the relative and subordinate character of these forms of knowledge, that at the same time they consider them as their own property and deny having received them from the Brahmins, and that finally they even go so far as to claim they are superior to those which are the exclusive possession of the latter. What results from this in the conceptions of the revolting Kshatriyas is the inversion of the normal relations between principles and their applications, or even sometimes, in the most extreme cases, the pure and simple negation of any transcendent principle. It is therefore, in all cases, the substitution of physics for metaphysics, understanding these words in their rigorously etymological sense, or, in other words, what can be called naturalism, as will be seen even more clearly in what follows. From this distinction within sacred or traditional knowledge, of two orders that can generally be designated as that of principles and that of applications, or again, following what we have just said, as the metaphysical order and the physical order, was derived in the ancient mysteries, in the West as well as in the East, the distinction between what were called the greater mysteries and the lesser mysteries, the latter essentially comprising the knowledge of nature, and the former the knowledge of that which is beyond nature. This same distinction corresponded precisely to that between sacerdotal initiation and royal initiation, which is to say that the forms of knowledge taught in these two kinds of mysteries were those regarded as necessary for the exercise of the respective functions of the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas, or of what was the equivalent of these two castes in the institutions of various peoples. But naturally, it is the priesthood which, by virtue of its teaching function, equally conferred both initiations and which thus ensured the effective legitimacy, not only of its own members, but also of those of the caste to which the temporal power belonged. And it is from this, as we shall see, that the divine right of kings proceeds. If this is so, it is because the possession of the greater mysteries implies, a fortiori and as an added measure, that of the lesser mysteries. Just as every consequence and every application is contained within the principle from which it proceeds, the superior function eminently entails the possibilities of the inferior functions. This is necessarily so in any true hierarchy, that is to say, one founded upon the very nature of beings. There is yet another point that we must indicate here, at least briefly and without dwelling upon it unduly. Alongside the expressions sacerdotal initiation and royal initiation, and so to speak parallel to them, one also encounters those of sacerdotal art and royal art, which designate the implementation of the forms of knowledge taught in the corresponding initiations, along with the whole ensemble of techniques belonging to their respective domains. These designations were long preserved in the ancient corporations, and the second, that of royal art, has even had a rather singular destiny, for it has been transmitted down to modern masonry, in which, it goes without saying, it now survives, like many other terms and symbols, merely as a misunderstood vestige of the past. As for the designation of sacerdotal art, it has completely disappeared. Nevertheless, it obviously suited the art of the cathedral builders of the Middle Ages, in the same way as that of the temple builders of antiquity. But a confusion of the two domains must have subsequently occurred, due to an at least partial loss of the tradition, itself a consequence of the encroachments of the temporal upon the spiritual. And this is how even the name of the sacerdotal art was lost. No doubt around the time of the Renaissance, which indeed marks, in every respect, the consummation of the Western world's rupture with its own traditional doctrines. Chapter 3. Knowledge and Action. We have said above that the relations between the two powers, spiritual and temporal, must be determined by those of their respective domains. Thus reduced to its principle, the question seems to us very simple, for it is basically nothing other than that of the relations between knowledge and action. One might object to this that, according to what we have just set forth, the holders of the temporal power must also normally possess a certain knowledge. But aside from the fact that they do not possess it by themselves and that they receive it from the spiritual authority, this knowledge bears only upon the applications of the doctrine, and not upon the principles themselves. It is therefore, strictly speaking, only a knowledge by participation. Knowledge in the highest sense, the only one that truly deserves this name in the fullness of its meaning, is the knowledge of principles, independently of any contingent application, and it is this which belongs exclusively to those who possess spiritual authority, because there is nothing in it that pertains to the temporal order, even understood in its broadest sense. On the other hand, when one passes to the applications, one refers to this temporal order, because the knowledge is then no longer considered solely in itself and for itself, but insofar as it gives action its law. And it is to this extent that it is necessary for those whose proper function is essentially of the domain of action. It is evident that the temporal power, in its various military, judicial, and administrative forms, is entirely engaged in action. It is therefore, by its very attributes, enclosed within the same limits as the latter, that is to say, within the limits of the world that can properly be called human, understanding moreover by this term possibilities that are much more extensive than those usually considered therein. On the contrary, spiritual authority is founded entirely upon knowledge, since, as we have seen, its essential function is the conservation and teaching of the doctrine, and its domain is as unlimited as truth itself. What is reserved for it by the very nature of things, what it cannot communicate to men whose functions are of another order, and this because their possibilities do not entail it, is transcendent and supreme knowledge, that which surpasses the human domain and even more. Generally, the manifested world, that which is no longer physical but metaphysical in the etymological sense of this word. It must be well understood that this is not a matter of the sacerdotal caste wishing to keep the knowledge of certain truths for itself alone, but of a necessity that results directly from the differences in nature existing between beings, differences which, as we have already said, are the reason for being and the foundation of the distinction of castes. Men who are made for action are not made for pure knowledge, and, in a society constituted on truly traditional bases, each person must fulfill the function for which he is truly qualified. Otherwise, everything is merely confusion and disorder, no function is fulfilled as it should be, and this is precisely what is occurring in the present era. We are well aware that, due to this very confusion, the considerations we are setting forth here can only appear exceedingly strange in the modern Western world, where what is called spiritual most often has only a very distant relationship with the strictly doctrinal point of view and with knowledge freed from all contingencies. One may even, in this regard, make a rather curious observation. Today, people are no longer content to distinguish between the spiritual and the temporal, as is legitimate and even necessary to do, but rather they claim to separate them radically. And it so happens precisely that the two orders have never been as intermingled as they are at present, and that, above all, temporal preoccupations have never so profoundly affected that which should be absolutely independent of them. Doubtless it is inevitable that this should be so, owing to the very conditions of our era, which we have described elsewhere. Thus we must, in order to avoid any false interpretation, state clearly that what we are saying here concerns only what we called earlier spiritual authority in its pure state, and that one must be careful not to look for examples of it around us. One might even, if one wishes, consider that this is merely a theoretical and somewhat ideal type, although, truth be told, this way of viewing things is not entirely ours. We fully recognize that, in fact, in historical applications, contingencies must always be taken into account to a certain extent, yet we take the civilization of the modern West only for what it is, that is, for a deviation and an anomaly, which is moreover explained by its correspondence with the final phase of the Kali Yuga. But let us return to the relationship between knowledge and action. We have already had occasion to treat this question at some length, and consequently we shall not repeat here everything we said then. But it is nonetheless indispensable to recall at least the most essential points. We have considered the antithesis between the East and the West, in the present state of affairs, as being essentially reducible to this. The East maintains the superiority of knowledge over action, whereas the modern West affirms on the contrary the superiority of action over knowledge, when it does not go so far as the complete negation of the latter. We say the modern West only, for it was quite otherwise in antiquity and in the Middle Ages. All traditional doctrines, whether Eastern or Western, are unanimous in affirming the superiority and even the transcendence of knowledge in relation to action, with regard to which it plays, in a sense, the role of Aristotle's unmoved mover, which, of course, does not mean that action does not also have its legitimate place and importance in its own order, but this order is merely that of human contingencies. Change would be impossible without a principle from which it proceeds and which, by the very fact that it is its principle, cannot be subject to it, and thus is necessarily immobile, being the center of the wheel of things. Similarly, action, which belongs to the world of change, cannot have its principle within itself. All the reality of which it is capable is drawn from a principle that is beyond its domain, and which can only be found in knowledge. Knowledge alone, indeed, makes it possible to step outside the world of change or becoming and the limitations inherent to it, and, when it reaches the immutable, which is the case with principial or metaphysical knowledge, which is knowledge in the highest sense, it possesses immutability itself, for all true knowledge is essentially an identification with its object. Spiritual authority, by the very fact that it implies this knowledge, also possesses immutability within itself. Temporal power, on the contrary, is subject to all the vicissitudes of the contingent and the transitory, unless a higher principle communicates to it, to the extent compatible with its nature and character, the stability that it cannot possess by its own means. This principle can only be that which is represented by spiritual authority. Temporal power therefore needs, in order to subsist, a consecration that comes to it from the latter. It is this consecration that constitutes its legitimacy, that is to say, its conformity to the very order of things. Such was the underlying purpose of the royal initiation, which we defined in the previous chapter. And it is in this that the divine right of kings properly consists, or what the Far Eastern tradition calls the mandate of heaven. It is the exercise of temporal power by virtue of a delegation from spiritual authority, to which this power eminently belongs, as we explained then. Any action that does not proceed from knowledge lacks a principle and is nothing more than a vain agitation. Similarly, any temporal power that ignores its subordination to spiritual authority is equally vain and illusory. Separated from its principle, it will only be able to be exercised in a disorderly manner and will inevitably lead to its ruin. Since we have just spoken of the mandate of heaven, it will not be out of place to relate here how, according to Confucius himself, this mandate was to be fulfilled. The ancient princes, in order to make the natural virtues shine in the hearts of all men, applied themselves beforehand to governing their principalities well. In order to govern their principalities well, they beforehand established good order in their families. In order to establish good order in their families, they beforehand worked on perfecting themselves. In order to perfect themselves, they beforehand regulated the movements of their hearts. In order to regulate the movements of their hearts, they beforehand made their will perfect. In order to make their will perfect, they developed their knowledge as much as possible. One develops one's knowledge by investigating the nature of things. The nature of things once investigated, knowledge reaches its highest degree. Knowledge having reached its highest degree, the will becomes perfect. The will being perfect, the movements of the heart are regulated. The movements of the heart being regulated, the whole man is free from flaws. After having corrected oneself, one establishes order in the family. Order reigning in the family, the principality is well governed. The principality being well governed, soon the whole empire enjoys peace. One must acknowledge that there is here a conception of the role of the sovereign that differs singularly from the idea one might form of it in the modern West, and which moreover makes it much more difficult to fulfill, but also gives it a completely different scope. And it will be particularly noted that knowledge is expressly indicated as the primary condition for the establishment of order, even in the temporal domain. It is easy to understand now that the reversal of the relationship between knowledge and action, in a civilization, is a consequence of the usurpation of supremacy by temporal power. The latter, indeed, must then claim that there is no domain superior to its own, which is precisely that of action. However, if things stop there, they still do not reach the point where we currently see them, and where all value is denied to knowledge. For this to be the case, the Kshatriyas themselves must have been dispossessed of their power by the lower castes. Indeed, as we indicated previously, the Kshatriyas, even in revolt, tend rather to affirm a truncated doctrine, falsified by the ignorance or negation of everything that goes beyond the physical order, but in which there still subsist certain real, albeit inferior, forms of knowledge. They may even claim to pass off this incomplete and irregular doctrine as the expression of the true tradition. There is an attitude here which, although condemnable with regard to the truth, is still not devoid of a certain greatness. Moreover, are not terms like those of nobility, heroism, and honor, in their original sense, the designation of the qualities that are essentially inherent in the nature of the Kshatriyas? On the other hand, when the elements corresponding to the social functions of a lower order come to dominate in their turn, all traditional doctrine, even mutilated or altered, entirely disappears. Not even the slightest vestige of sacred science remains, and it is the reign of profane knowledge, that is to say, of ignorance that mistakes itself for science and revels in its nothingness. All this could be summarized in these few words. The supremacy of the Brahmins maintains doctrinal orthodoxy. The revolt of the Kshatriyas brings about heterodoxy. But with the domination of the lower castes comes intellectual night, And this is where the West stands today, which, moreover, threatens to spread its own darkness over the whole world. We will perhaps be reproached for speaking as if there were castes everywhere, and for unduly extending to every social organization denominations that strictly apply only to that of India. And yet, since these denominations ultimately do you want access to this and all the complete audiobooks on the channel, plus the ebook version? Click the link in the description or scan the QR code in the left corner of the screen to access our library, where you can listen to your favorite esoteric books without ad interruptions, lock your screen, or use other apps while the narration plays, and even download the ebook version to follow along as you listen. Listen on your computer via web browser, or download the app from the Play Store. After subscribing, you will receive an email with your login details, password, and step-by-step instructions on how to access the books through the Hotmart app.